Imagine standing on a narrow mountain ridge in the Caucasus. Snow is falling sideways in the wind. Far below you in the valley, you can see the orange glow of fires where villages once stood. Behind you is a black wall of rock and forest, pierced only by goat trails and avalanche chutes. In front of you, beyond the last fold of mountains, lies the Black Sea, and on the far side of that water, unknown lands with names whispered in your village for generations: Istanbul, Damascus, maybe even America. For centuries, this was the reality for the peoples of the North Caucasus: Circassians, Chechens, Ingush, and many others. The mountains were not just scenery, they were a shield, a hiding place, and sometimes the last road out when an empire decided that your people no longer belonged on their own land. While the Russian Empire pushed south with muskets, cannons, and later railroads, while the United States, on the other side of the world, was laying telegraph lines and building transcontinental railways, the Circassians were fighting a desperate, uneven war to keep their homes in these mountains. In the American imagination, the 19th century is the age of the steam engine, the telegraph, and the frontier. In the Caucasus, it was the age of the Great March North of Russian troops and the Great March West of entire peoples driven to the sea. The conflict that historians now call the Russo-Circassian War lasted officially from 1763 to 1864, more than 100 years of campaigns, raids, and reprisal massacres. Russian generals looked at maps of the Northwest Caucasus and saw a problem: fractal ridges and deep valleys filled with independent mountaineers who did not pay taxes, did not accept Russian law, and had a reputation for fighting like ghosts, appearing out of the fog, hitting hard, and then vanishing back into the forests. Their solution was brutal and, in modern terms, chillingly systematic. Over decades, Russian forces burned Circassian villages, cut down orchards, destroyed grain stores, and trampled fields under the hooves of their cavalry. Orders from the imperial center made the goal explicit: push the Circassians off their fertile lands and replace them with reliable Christian settlers, Russians, Ukrainians, and Cossacks, who would be loyal to St. Petersburg. In May 1864, after a final series of offensives, the Russian army staged a victory ceremony near what is now Sochi. Officers attended a church service beneath imperial banners, while in the surrounding valleys, columns of Circassian families were being herded toward the Black Sea coast. For the empire, it was the triumph of civilization over wild mountaineers. For the Circassians, it was the beginning of what they still call the Great Exile, Büyük Sürgün. Imagine again that mountain ridge. Now, instead of a handful of fighters, you see hundreds of people moving in a long, broken line down toward the sea. Old men leaning on sticks, women carrying infants and bundles, children driving a few surviving animals. Behind them, Russian soldiers burn the last houses. Ahead of them, officers promise that ships will carry them to good lands under the Sultan across the water. At ports like Anapa, Novorossiysk, Tuapse, Sochi, and Adler, beaches and hillsides turned into open-air camps. Foreign observers wrote of tens of thousands of people camped on the shore without shelter or clean water, waiting for any vessel that could carry them away. Disease ran through the camps: cholera, typhus, malaria, cutting down the weakest before they even saw a ship. When ships did come, they were often old, overcrowded, and badly provisioned. Records from a single voyage in 1865 showed that of 2,346 Circassians loaded in Istanbul and sent to Cyprus, only 1,351 arrived alive. Many had already contracted malaria on the way and would suffer again on the island, where the disease was endemic. Multiply that one crossing by hundreds, and you begin to understand why modern estimates speak of hundreds of thousands and dead, perhaps 1 million or more, in the course of the Circassian deportations. By the end of the 19th century, Russian censuses showed only a fraction of the original Circassian population still living in their ancestral lands on the northeast shore of the Black Sea. Some estimates say barely 3% remained. The rest had been scattered across the Ottoman Empire, in the highlands of Anatolia, along the coasts of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, in Jordan and Syria, even as far as Sudan. While this was happening, the United States was going through its own era of upheaval: civil war, reconstruction, industrialization, and the closing of the frontier. The difference is striking. American power in that period was measured in miles of railroad track, telegraph messages sent, and patents filed for new machines. Russian power in the Caucasus was measured in burned villages, emptied valleys, and the number of people pushed onto rickety ships. Historians today debate what happened to the Circassians should be called genocide under the definition adopted by the United Nations after World War II. The legal arguments are complex, but the facts are stark. A deliberate campaign to remove an entire people from their homeland using warfare, hunger, and forced deportation, with full knowledge that vast numbers would die along the way. In 2011, the Parliament of Georgia formally recognized the events of 1864 as a premeditated genocide against the Circassians by the Russian Empire. For the survivors and their descendants, the label matters less than the memory. In villages across Turkey and the Middle East today, Circassian families still tell stories of night marches down mountain paths, of waiting on freezing beaches, of seeing the coastline of their homeland disappear over the horizon. They preserved their language and dances, their clan names and wedding songs, even as they became citizens of new states. The exile became the defining event of their identity, a wound that never fully closed. Now shift the camera forward in time, into the 20th century. The Russian Empire is gone, replaced by the Soviet Union. The American frontier is closed, and the United States has become not just a regional power, but a global one, building aircraft carriers, satellites, and interstate highways. But in the Caucasus, one thing has not changed. The mountains are still there, and so are the people who see them as both home and refuge. The Soviet state inherited both the territory and many of the instincts of the old empire. In Moscow, planners looked at regions like Chechnya and Ingushetia, Muslim, montane, with a long history of resisting outside rule, and saw potential fifth columns, especially when foreign armies drew near. During World War II, with the Wehrmacht advancing into the Caucasus from the west, Stalin and his security chief, Beria, decided to solve their Caucasus problem with methods disturbingly familiar from the 19th century. On February 23, 1944, Soviet security forces launched Operation Lentil. In the space of a few days, virtually the entire Chechen and Ingush populations, around 333,000 people by some counts, were rounded up, loaded into cattle cars, and deported thousands of kilometers to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The official charge was mass treason and collaboration with the Germans. But researchers who have examined Wehrmacht records and Soviet archives point out that Chechen-Ingush territory was never fully occupied by Nazi forces, and that no credible evidence of collective treason existed. In the lowlands, the deportations were brutal, but at least logistically straightforward: trucks to railheads, then trains east. In the mountains, they could be much worse. Orders circulated that the elderly, the sick, and anyone unfit for transport were to be liquidated on the spot. There are testimonies of barns full of people being burned, of small mountain hamlets wiped out because snow made it impossible to move everyone quickly. For Chechens and Ingush, this event is remembered as Ardakh, the exile or the exodus, echoing both biblical language and the earlier Circassian catastrophe. Once again, an entire people from the Caucasus highlands was uprooted in the name of state security. Once again, the mountains that had sheltered resistance fighters now became traps, places where the most vulnerable could not be moved and were therefore destroyed. In the decades that followed, some deportees attempted to make their way back home on their own, slipping away from collective farms in Central Asia, riding trains without tickets, and hiking through passes to find the ruins of their ancestral villages. Only in 1957, under Nikita Khrushchev, were Chechens and Ingush officially allowed to return and re-establish their republic. Even then, they found many of their lands occupied by settlers from other regions, sowing the seeds of new conflicts. Once again, if you place this story next to what was happening in the United States at the same time, the contrast is hard to miss. In the 1950s, Americans were building interstates and suburbs, watching the first color televisions, and sending the first satellites into orbit, technologies that would shrink distance and tie a continent together. The Soviet Union was also racing into space and building heavy industry, but in its internal borderlands, it was still ruling with boxcars, barbed wire, and deportation lists. At the cultural level, there was a similar divergence. In the North Caucasus, a figure emerged in Chechen folklore and practice, an abrek. An abrek was an outlaw, but not in the Hollywood sense of a simple thief. He was someone who turned his back on society and lived alone or in small bands in the mountains, robbing officials and collaborators, avenging perceived injustices, and often acquiring a kind of dark saintly aura in local storytelling. To Moscow, abreks were criminals and bandits. To many villagers, they were symbols that the mountains themselves still had a will of their own, beyond the reach of any government. In the United States, that same period produced different myths: the daring test pilot breaking the sound barrier, the engineer in a white shirt and thin tie designing a new microchip, the astronaut riding a Saturn rocket. Both societies told stories about men pushing limits, but one set of stories played out on mountain ledges, in ambushes, and in whispered songs about revenge. The other played out on TV broadcasts of launches, in glossy magazines about the house of the future, in the glow of kitchen appliances at exhibitions like the 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow. At that exhibition, Soviet citizens wandered through a full-scale model of an American home, staring at refrigerators full of frozen food, dishwashers and electric ovens, listening to salesmen talk confidently about a future of leisure and convenience. Khrushchev argued loudly with Vice President Richard Nixon about whether this abundance was real or just a capitalist trick. But for people from places like the Caucasus, where memory still held images of cattle cars and exile, that scene was not just a curiosity, it was a reminder that there existed another way to measure progress besides the tonnage of steel or the number of tanks. Fast forward again into the 1990s and early 2000s. The Soviet Union has collapsed. New borders run across the Caucasus. Russia fights two brutal wars in Chechnya, leveling cities like Grozny with artillery and air power. Once again, when the lowlands burn, people run for the mountains. Chechen fighters and civilians retreat into the highlands, using the same logic their ancestors had used against Tsars and commissars. The higher you go, the harder it is for a conventional army to follow. From there, some slip across the ridges into Pankisi Gorge in neighboring Georgia, a narrow valley inhabited by Kists, an ethnic group closely related to Chechens. Pankisi becomes for a few years a byword in Western media for a lawless enclave where refugees and guerrillas mix, where Russian officials claim terrorists are hiding, and where Georgian and U.S. forces carry out joint patrols and training missions. By this time, the technology watching the Caucasus has changed completely. In the 19th century, Russian generals had to rely on scouts and painfully slow maps. In Stalin's era, NKVD commanders leaned on train timetables and paper lists to move whole nations. In the 1990s, American intelligence satellites can see individual tracks in the snow. Drones and reconnaissance aircraft can peer into gorges known only to shepherds and smugglers. For mountain peoples, including Circassians, Chechens, and others, this is a new kind of exposure. Their ridges and passes are no longer invisible to outsiders, yet the basic pattern persists. When cities are bombed, when the police crack down, people still aim for the high ground, then either dig in or try to cross a frontier, into Georgia, into Turkey, sometimes even further, towards Western Europe and North America. So where does the American viewer fit into this story? Why should someone watching YouTube in Texas or Ohio care about Circassians pushed onto ships in 1864, or Chechens rounded up in 1944, or refugees slipping through Pankisi in 2001? Because in each of these episodes, there is a moment, sometimes literal, sometimes symbolic, when the people running from Russian or Soviet power encounter the modern West and often react with a mixture of shock, envy, and hope. And just as many Germans during World War II later admitted how impressed they were by American logistics and technology, by the endless lines of trucks, the air support, the field kitchens, so too did people from the Soviet sphere, including the Caucasus, find themselves astonished by what American society had built. Think of a Circassian family, descendant of exiles, visiting the United States for the first time in the late 20th century. They walk into an American supermarket and see, under bright fluorescent lights, more food on a single aisle than their grandparents might have seen in a year in the North Caucasus. They notice that the coldest thing they feel that day is not a mountain wind, but the air from the freezer doors filled with ice cream and frozen vegetables. For them, the story of progress is not abstract. It's the distance between a cattle car and a jumbo jet, between a ration card and a credit card. Even for Russian elites, the gap could be shocking. In the late 1980s, Boris Yeltsin famously visited a supermarket in Houston and was stunned by the variety and abundance, asking ordinary shoppers whether such choice was really normal in America. If a future Russian president could be shaken by a grocery store, imagine what a mountaineer from a village that had been razed, rebuilt, and razed again would feel. In the Cold War, the United States invested in not only missiles and tanks, but in making everyday life a showcase of its system: the car in every driveway, the TV in every living room, the appliances in every kitchen. Soviet leaders tried to respond, but for many on the periphery, especially in regions like the Caucasus with long memories of exile, the promises never quite matched the lived reality. So when you hear about Circassians campaigning for recognition of genocide, or Chechen refugees trying to reach Europe or North America, or activists in the Caucasus using smartphones and social media to show the world what is happening in their valleys, you are seeing the latest chapter in a very old story. A story in which mountains are both fortress and cage, in which empires try to impose order with force, and in which the idea of the free world, with all its contradictions, still holds a powerful pull. For Americans, there is a reason to feel a certain pride in that. Not pride in someone else's suffering, but in the fact that time and again, people running from the abuses of authoritarian systems have looked to societies like the United States as places where they might rebuild their lives. From Circassians who eventually reached the New World to Chechens who found asylum in Western countries, the direction of flight is telling. At the same time, these stories are a reminder that technological and economic superiority come with responsibility. The same satellites and media networks that let Americans watch wars in the Caucasus from thousands of miles away also make it harder to pretend not to see when whole communities are driven from their homes. The same abundance that stunned Yeltsin in a Houston supermarket can look like a promise to someone whose family history is one long line of expulsions and forced marches. When you zoom out, the pattern is clear. In 1864, Circassian families moved along mountain paths and crowded onto wooden ships, pushed out by an empire that measured power in conquered valleys and resettled farmlands. In 1944, Chechen and Ingush families were packed into rail cars and sent east by a regime that claimed to be building a workers' paradise, but still ruled its fringes with collective punishment. In the 1990s and 2000s, new generations fled through the same ridges, this time under the eye of satellites and cameras, seeking not the Ottoman Empire, but modern states that promised the rule of law and individual rights. On the other side of the world, in the same centuries, Americans went from log cabins to skyscrapers, from Pony Express riders to smartphones, from wooden sailing ships to GPS-guided container vessels and airliners. It is not arrogance to notice that difference. It is simply recognizing that for people living in the shadow of the Caucasus, the map of hope has shifted, and that the stars they navigate by now often include names like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. When you watch these histories as an American, you are not just a spectator of someone else's tragedy. You are also, whether you realize it or not, part of the backdrop, the society that, for better or worse, has become a reference point for what normal life could look like after exile. And maybe that is the deepest lesson of the Circassian exodus and its echoes in Soviet times, that high mountains can keep a people alive through centuries of persecution, but it often takes the pull of a distant, freer world to give their children and grandchildren a future that is more than just survival. For many in the Caucasus, that freer world has a very specific image. Highways lit at night, supermarkets full of food, schools with computers, laws that can be argued in open court. In other words, something that looks, in their eyes, a lot like America.